In November 1941, my grandfather from my mom's side had a severe heart attack and was taken to the hospital in Des Moines, Iowa. We visited my grandfather on December 7th, 1941, along with my mom's sister and her husband Bob, who currently lived in Wisconsin at that point. They had come down to see my ailing granddad that was on life support in the hospital in Des Moines. And so they visited them. And then my dad, the farmer, had to leave in the afternoon to get home to do the chores and milk the cows, because you can't leave the cows unmilked even if somebody's sick. Somebody has to milk the cows.
For sure.
And so Uncle Bob and I and my dad were driving back. And that's when we got news on the radio, which was the only way we got news back then, that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and it was a huge loss of ships and life. And Pearl Harbor, of course, was the start of World War II. We quickly declared war on Germany and Japan, which changed everybody's lives. The government quickly started drafting many soldiers and sailors, 18 to 35. My dad was exempted as a farmer because food production was considered an essential service. But my Uncle Bob, a school teacher, was drafted into the Navy as an officer because he was a little older. They started rationing everything with ration books, and they rationed gasoline, tires, sugar, coffee, butter, meat, dairy, dried fruit, jams, jellies, shortening, and shoes. With the license stamps, you were only allowed to have one pair of shoes a year. The shoes were normally made out of leather, and so they needed the leather to make army boots for all the troops going overseas. These items were considered hard to get and were needed to equip our Army and Navy. The Navy at that point decided to build a training base near Ottumwa because they needed inland bases.
And Ottumwa is right near where you grew up.
Ottumwa was about 9 miles from where I grew up, and the base was about the same thing. And that's where they trained Navy pilots who practiced their landing and takeoffs from there. So that central base was near Ottumwa, and then they needed landing strips out in the countryside, so they would fly out from the base, make a touch and go landing, and go on to another one and do another touch and go landing to get experience doing landings and takeoffs. And these were twin wing yellow twin wing airplanes. You may see them around once in a while these days in old shows and things like that. And apparently this very stable kind of a plane that you're less likely to kill yourself in than most of the others. But these were all 18-year-old kids that were flying these planes that had very little experience, and so they needed a lot of training. You weren't bringing anybody that had previous training and experience in at that point. And and one of these landing strips, they took part of our farm. So the government rented our farm for a certain time period during World War II, along with a neighboring farm, to make a landing strip where these airplanes could come in and land and take off and do their thing. And an interesting point about that air base in Ottumwa, during a brief time, the second in command was a lieutenant commander, Richard M. Nixon. And he and his wife, Pat, lived in Ottumwa for a while in a rented house while he was doing his Navy thing during World War II. The base was opened in 1942 and closed in 1947.
Do you remember seeing the planes land and stuff
Oh,
as a kid?
yeah, sure. I mean, I was 5 years old in 41, and I was 1947. I was 11. So sure, that was and I remember when the lieutenant flew out from the air base and signed the paperwork to turn the farm back over to my dad so we could begin farming again on that land that had been used as a landing strip.
How much of the land was taken?
I think they took about 70 acres from our farm, and they probably took about 80 acres from another farm, so they probably had about 150 acres of...
And how big is your farm?
Our farm back at that point was a 400-acre farm.
Wow.
So, but this was some of the best productive land of the farm. All the farm isn't quite as productive as this was, so they wanted a nice, level, productive...
And was that a sacrifice just as the war effort, or were you guys getting compensated enough for the...
We were paid rent for the farm, but we would have made more if we could have raised crops on the farm.
Oh, wow.
But labor was in short supply back then, so it wasn't so critical that we could rent some space out, because fellows were all being that worked
Drafted.
on our farm were all being drafted into the service, so they weren't.
So you had a lot of employees on the farm, kind of thing?
Not. We normally had a hired man and his wife, and if he had children, they lived in the small house that was on the farm.
Gotcha.
And so that was typically our employment status. It varied from time to time, and sometimes you couldn't find somebody. Once in a while, they hired a single fellow that my mom had to keep in the house, which she was not too happy doing, but that had to work out too, to have some help from time to time.